Hi, welcome to this special report on COVID-19 from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm the anchor of politics and accountability reporting. I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. Coming up today, 2.4 million Americans filed for unemployment last week, and that makes the 9-week total during this pandemic more than 38 million Americans. We'll talk about that and also efforts among some in the White House to wind down the enhanced unemployment benefits. But first, here are some of the top stories that we're watching right now. Cases of coronavirus around the world have topped 5 million. Also, more than 300,000 deaths reported. Now, let me point out the United States alone has more than 90,000 of those deaths. Yesterday was the worst day yet for cases globally, according to the director of the World Health Organization. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, has expressed concern over how people are interpreting the government's name of the effort to get a vaccine. This is Operation Warp Speed. Fauci told the Washington Post that he doesn't want people to think they're jumping over safety steps, only financial investments. We'll also talk more about that later on. But first, let's start with these unemployment numbers with my guest, Tony Romm, senior tech policy reporter, and Jeff Stein, White House economics reporter. So good to see both of you. Tony, just take us through the numbers first. You know, we watch these numbers every week. What does it mean to see 2.4 million more Americans file jobless claims?
Right. Well, it means the economy is still continuing to get worse as we continue to see businesses closed and the United States figuring out exactly what its economic response is going to be. And so, as you pointed out, we're now up to 38 million Americans, more than 38 million Americans who have filed unemployment claims in the better part of the past 8 or 9 weeks since we declared that state of emergency due to the coronavirus. And while the individual week numbers are beginning to get lower, last week's claims, as announced today, are fewer than they were in the week prior to that. It's largely a reflection of the fact that so many people have already lost their jobs. There aren't that many people left who can still lose their jobs, according to some of the economists that we talked about. So this has sort of teed up this huge fight in Washington now over exactly what the congressional response should be here, if there has to be additional stimulus to help these people over the long term.
So, Tony, if someone files for unemployment benefits right now, if they file successfully, what happens? And I say successfully because there's been a lot of frustration and a lot of trouble because, state unemployment benefits agencies have been just overwhelmed by a flood of people. So if you're able to do it, what do you get?
Well, you eventually get a payment, but you're absolutely right. It has taken quite a long time for people to get benefits. Now, in a perfect world, what would have happened is somewhat instantaneously, you might have received a check. That check, the amount of it would vary depending on the state you live in, since the unemployment amounts are set by state governments. And then on top of that, the federal government has approved $600 a week in extra payments for everybody up until the end of July. But in a lot of cases, what we saw is that it took quite some time for the states to begin to implement those extra $600 payments. So in many cases, people are just starting to really take home that cash that was promised to them.
So, Jeff, President Trump is floating the idea of trying to end these additional payments. What's the logic there?
Republicans and the president have, and numerous business interests have argued that these additional unemployment benefits are creating a disincentive to work. Their case is that as money came online for small businesses, a lot of these businesses were unable to rehire workers because they claim workers can make more money sitting at home collecting this enhanced unemployment program than they would going into work. And while I don't want to give that case full credit, there are instances in which that appears to have happened. Many economists, however, I would say the consensus view among economists is that cutting off these benefits now could be very dangerous. The economy, as Tony rightly pointed out, is at an extremely perilous moment. This is a vital lifeline for as many as 25 million people right now and more soon. If that benefit is cut or dramatically reduced, these people are not going to have money to spend. A lot of people are struggling right now to make rent payments, to put food on the table, and a dramatic reduction of those benefits could lead to that. But Trump and the Republicans are saying this is going to allow people to stay at home and make more money than going to work, and so they're determined to get rid of it and have been really since it was first passed in March.
So, what's the Democratic reaction?
Well, Democrats have been outraged. Nancy Pelosi included an extension of these benefits in the House package passed last week. But really, in the tussle and the jockeying over the next congressional stimulus package, what we're seeing is that extending these benefits could require a major concession from the Democrats. And they passed a number of measures that they regard as vital in the last bill. It included housing reforms, money for renters, hazard pay for frontline workers, OSHA protections for nurses, a lot of stuff that Democrats have been saying for months is critical to get done. But it looks like they may have to give in just to get back to the status quo, just to maintain the level of unemployment benefits that have already been authorized. But yes, they've been condemning Trump for this move, even though I think it's fair to say that some of them have quietly and privately acknowledged that they've heard from business interests that are concerned that people are making more money staying at home than they would be going to work.
Tony, great graphic here on the screen with us that shows these initial claims for unemployment. And we talked about this already, but I just want to emphasize, even though it looks like it's going down, that's just because we're talking about first-time filers. The number of initial claims are going down, but that's all adding up to just these, tens of millions of people who are unemployed.
Yeah, it's adding up to more than 38 million who have sought unemployment claims so far. And it's actually more complicated than that. It's not just that we've seen a very large uptick in people applying for unemployment, and that number has gone down as more people have been out of work. Some of the number reflects the backlog of the states are sort of working their way through. Some states have been much faster at others at sort of processing the applications they've received. In other cases, it's certainly the case that states are reopening slowly but surely. More people are coming back onto the job. So that sort of factors into the numbers that you begin to see here. But I think the consensus view among a lot of economists is that you're not immediately going to see this thing reverse itself. We're not going to suddenly see mass re-employment as states begin to reopen, even as we're starting to see them reopen right now.
Jeff, you point out that members of Congress are hearing from business and representatives of business who are concerned that people will opt to stay home. But we're also seeing concerns raised by labor, because some people are staying home not because of money, but because they're worried about getting sick and they feel like it's the safer move. So it's sort of a triangle here: labor, business, and then lawmakers.
Yeah, and this question of what businesses have to do to protect their workers and the employees that come into their store, if they run a store, has become a key source of division between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans have pushed for a liability shield, a waiver that would essentially prevent employees or customers from suing businesses if they contract COVID-19 at their place of business. Democrats are pushing very hard in the opposite direction. For months, they've been demanding that OSHA and the Department of Labor increase the standards by which employers have to give PPE and protect people. They want the federal government to be able to fine employers who do not provide adequate safety and do not, enforce social distancing and enforce protections among their workers. Republicans have now said that this is a red line demand, that if there's going to be aid for states, that they require that this liability protection be in there. Democrats have said that that's not going anywhere. The last few packages we've seen on the Hill have been largely bipartisan, especially the CARES Act, overwhelmingly approved. Not a single person in the Senate voted against it. Now we're starting to see real divisions emerge as this stretches on. Congress is not really working together on a bipartisan basis that characterized the initial response to this crisis. So that is going to be obviously a huge dynamic to watch going forward.
Let's talk about the argument of this money not just helping people who are trying to pay their rent and get by and, provide food for themselves and their family, but it can also be seen as a stimulus to the economy, a way to help people keep spending money. So, Tony, what's the logic there?
Right. Well, as you just exactly pointed out, people need this money in order to pay their bills, in order to pay either for mortgages or to pay their rents or to go out and just make daily purchases for things like groceries. Now, traditionally, unemployment is not a full substitute for folks and their former wages. In a lot of cases, people will get much less than what they were making previously. What sort of makes this so complicated is because lawmakers did want to get people close to what they were making previously. They wanted to keep them as financially solvent as possible. They knew that they were out of work through no fault of their own. But it is, in fact, the case that for some people, this is now more money than they were receiving previously. But if they're not getting that money, that means bills aren't being paid. creditors aren't being paid, money isn't being injected into the system in terms of shopping and other sorts of purchases. So, there's a real tug and pull here. If there isn't that sort of stimulus, Democrats and economists think that the economy could take an even bigger hit. That's why they're calling on Congress to act.
So, Tony, I want you to compare this for us, what happened, during the 2008 financial crisis. So we're talking more than a decade ago now. And we also saw politicians in Washington, leap forward to try to provide some stimulus and also give these extended unemployment benefits that went on far longer than sort of the regular 26-week run. What do they do now? And is that seen as a model? What did they do then? Excuse me. And is that seen as a model?
Right. Last time, it was a much different collapse. We weren't talking about a pandemic. We were talking about the utter destruction of the financial system. And so what we saw over the course of a little over a year was a series of efforts to extend unemployment benefits, and it ultimately brought them to 99 weeks. Now, that was just as contested then as this conversation is now. There were a lot of Republicans who were very antagonistic at the time. It certainly came with a cost to the federal government that spent the money on those additional benefits. We had Republicans who were in control of parts of the legislature, and so then President Barack Obama had a very difficult sell to get that through. But the thinking on the part of Democrats then was that you had to put money into the pockets of Americans or they simply weren't going to spend. And in the absence of that spending, things just simply weren't going to improve. So fast forward to now, more than a decade later, the difference here is that we're not talking about 99 weeks in the middle of a financial crisis. And lawmakers this time have plussed up the size of the benefit, which didn't exactly happen in the '08 recession. But the conversation is very much the same in this respect, which is, to what extent should unemployment be a form of economic stimulus? And Democrats just see it as critical to what the government should be doing going forward.
So meanwhile, Jeff, the president's chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, says that the White House is talking about a massive tax cut for corporations if they can bring the overseas supply chains to the United States. Why is that part of the conversation? And could that get, pulled into this fight over a stimulus package?
Yeah, it's really all about China at this point. The president has fumed very angrily about China. Initially, the president praised China's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, said they were doing a very good job in a difficult situation. Since then, since obviously the virus came to the US, the president has grown much more negative about China, and that's led to, and to be fair, a bipartisan discussion about what can be done in response to China. And we've seen bipartisan proposals emerge in the Senate that include trying to figure out how to onshore American manufacturing, particularly the American production of PPE and other pharmaceutical goods we're incredibly dependent on China for right now. That is the context in which the Kudlow proposal you're referring to emerged. That idea is to give a dramatic corporate tax cut. Republicans in 2017 already lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Kudlow was talking about lowering it from 21% to 10.5% for corporations that move their supply chains back to the US. A lot of economists I speak to say that's very unlikely to work. The size of the benefit is not great enough, and you see lots of gains with this kind of benefit and could amount to a large corporate subsidy, a big giveaway for corporations that have already benefited from this administration. But it's interesting to see the White House try to grok towards some sort of repercussion for China. There was discussion early on that we reported that the president's advisors were trying to come up with a bill of reparations that they could send China damages done from coronavirus and expect the Chinese to pay it. The reaction to that was that that's about as likely to happen as Mexico is to pay for the border wall. That there's just not really an actual response to the problem. And really, what's kind of interesting about this fight is that it's sort of, we've seen that a lot of trouble with these proposals in that people fear that if the US responds to China aggressively, China will retaliate. And some people say, well, that's a reason not to do it. Some people also say that's a reason to do it in the first place because it sort of affirms the need to do something about American dependence on Chinese supply and Chinese production.
But of course, we're also watching the supply chains in terms of where we get protective equipment, where masks come from, as you mentioned, and also where a vaccine will eventually be generated from. So some are concerned about.
Yeah, and Peter Peter Navarro, one of the top White House advisors, has an executive order that he wrote months ago that's been sitting on Trump's desk that would require the federal government to purchase PPE supplies that were made in the US. That has not been signed because there's a fear that China will restrict its current shipments of supplies to the US. So it's a knotty issue.
Yeah. Tony, you have been looking at families in New England who have been struggling to pay the bills, but are now also struggling just to, pay their rent or pay their mortgage. And you profiled one family in New Hampshire that made it through April. They were able to pay the bills because of that federal stimulus relief money, but it's now May, and it's gotten all the more harder, not easier, to figure out how to pay the bills.
Right. It's gotten harder for a lot of families. I mean, this is the stakes of the conversation that we're having right now about the future of unemployment, the future of federal stimulus, and so forth. It's the story of this woman, Carrie Duran, who I talked to just outside of New Hampshire, who told me that, she's always sort of lived on the line between being able to afford things and not. And this crisis brought by the coronavirus has just made it all that much harder for her. And so, for a lot of families around the country, there are some things in place that are helping them right now. They have access to unemployment. Many of them received stimulus checks a few weeks ago. And generally speaking, there are moratoria on evictions and foreclosures to keep people in their homes now. But the story of Carrie tells us that all of that stuff eventually is going to expire. The unemployment benefits could be in a place where at the end of July, people are not receiving that extra $600. The stimulus payments, in many cases, already have been spent. And for renters who have benefited a great deal from these policies, eventually that payment that they postponed is going to come due. And so, the big data point in the story that we put together earlier this week came from the Boston Fed, which took a look at homeowners and renters within the 6-state New England region, which has been just disproportionately hard hit in terms of unemployment. And what they found essentially is that we could see a situation in which hundreds of thousands of families, more than 300,000 families, even right now with the aid that's in their pocket, may not be able to make their monthly mortgage and rent payments, which means they'd be behind about $500 million each month. That number blossoms even further into the millions in terms of families who can't make the payments, and billions with respect to the actual cost of the payments if the aid begins to expire, if Congress hadn't done anything at all. And so the message from the Boston Fed and for others who we talked to for the story is that if Congress doesn't begin to authorize additional aid, we're going to see this happen nationwide. We're going to see families who simply cannot keep pace with their bills, and we could see a housing crisis on our hands.
Something fascinating that you reported in your piece is that in New Hampshire, about 70% of the mortgages there are federally connected in some way. And you heard that from the executive director of the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. So they're already interconnected.
Right. And that's a good thing in this case. The actions taken by Congress and the CARES Act generally help people who have federally backed mortgages. Those folks are able to take advantage of a system where they could postpone their payments to potentially the end of their mortgage. So when all is said and done, when we emerge from this crisis, they're not on the hook to make some lump sum payment of a couple months that they weren't able to afford. It's not exactly the case across the board for people who have private lenders who hold their mortgages. That's sort of been a state by state, lender by lender situation. And it's certainly not the case with respect to renters who really didn't get that protection at all. There's this really significant concern that renters who postpone their payments are just going to be on the hook for thousands and thousands of dollars in a single shot. And if they're not able to make it, we could see major hits to credit scores. We could see evictions. We could see other kinds of negative consequences that these families, it's not their fault they're out of work. It's because we shut things down to coronavirus. So that's why we were beginning to see this new conversation calling for billions of dollars in aid in Washington. I mean, one proposal put forward $100 billion just for renters, though, like everything else we've talked about, that's kind of stuck as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the big questions, Jeff, is like, where does the money come from, right? Where does all the spending come from? And we actually had a question written in by one of our viewers who wanted to get to the heart of that. Catherine in Iowa wants to know, where's all this money coming from and what will be done to repay the debt? So is there much of a conversation happening about that right now?
I've heard this from readers as well, but it's really worth noting that right now most economists are not concerned about the potential fiscal and deficit impacts of the spending we're seeing from Congress. Yes, it's been a tremendous surge in spending. I think it's unprecedented. the White House has said it dwarfs even some of the biggest measures passed in the New Deal. We just are expecting deficits from April alone of close to $800 billion. We're used to seeing trillion-dollar deficits for an entire year. We're close to seeing that for April alone. It gives you a sense of the scale of something we're dealing with that's bigger than really any kind of spending we've seen ever before. And really, politically, this could be important because the president's senior advisors, Mark Meadows, Russ Vought, a lot of them come from a conservative world. They come from the Heritage Foundation. They come from the Freedom Caucus. And they are typically very averse to deficit spending and view that as a dangerous game to play. But right now, what we're seeing is that the dollar is still strong. Treasuries are still in very high demand. And there's no real sign of inflation coming down the pike anytime soon. So the typical things that economists worry about when we spend a lot of money, when we have a lot of deficit spending, don't really seem to be in play right now. It's possible in many years or in a few years that the amount of spending leads to an inflationary crisis where the cost of goods goes up very rapidly, and that could cause real problems for American families. But for now, we're not really seeing that, and that's why most economists are still saying that the key is to continue to spend.
You filed a story a couple weeks ago, Jeff, and I feel like time is such like a different pace these days, right? It's all sort of melding together, but at the same time, every week the coronavirus story changes so significantly. So you filed a story a couple weeks ago talking about some of those conservative advisors to the president, like Mark Meadows, who are worried about the spending and how they hadn't really quite gotten the president's ear on that. Like he wasn't as concerned. Is he more concerned now?
That's a very good question. And I wish my reporting was more able to tell you exactly where the president's head is at this second. It shifts a lot. I mean, the president has now been making a lot of noise about his concern about a bailout for states. This has become something that a lot of people on the right are opposed to. They say, why should we be funding the pensions of Illinois and New York and other states that are dealing with severe economic hits and have asked the federal government to step in and provide revenue to compensate for what's going on. So I think right now the president is still trusting Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Mnuchin is viewed among the people we speak to in the White House and the administration as much more willing to cut deals with Democrats that increase spending, and he has been for some time, much less concerned about the deficit than many of the president's other top advisors. And Democrats are quite happy about Mnuchin's role. They'll criticize him in public, but privately they say, this is a guy we can work with. This is a guy who understands that we need to increase spending to deal with this crisis. But there are a lot of other people in the president's ear, quite frequently Meadows and Vought, who are making this point that we need to deal with the deficit at some point. It's a real danger. But who the president is listening to among those factions can change very quickly. And reminds me I should probably call some of them to see what's going on right now.
Well, one last question for you, Jeff. The National Governors Association has been calling for like $500 billion in aid to help with budget shortfalls. We've also been watching and tracking to see how much aid is going to like blue states versus red states. So even as there are some questions about just how much aid states should get, what are the states asking for, and where do they see the need?
So Pelosi's bill included over $1 trillion for states, as well as territories, and I think some other governments, municipalities. The governors' associations have asked for about $500 billion. I think we're likely to see less than that, frankly. Republicans have become so divided on this question. There's some conservative activists I've talked to are quite worried that they feel that they're losing the fight within the Republican caucus, that increasingly they hear from Republican senators who are worried and up for re-election in difficult states that there will be tons of layoffs and that these Republican senators will get the blame if they're opposing state aid. Even in states like Montana and Maine, not necessarily the most blue states controlled by Republicans, we're still hearing concerns that those Republicans might vote for state aid from conservatives who oppose this. So I think we're going to come at lower than $500 billion, but I think even the White House is acknowledging sort of quietly that this is going to be something that has to be done to avoid hundreds of thousands of layoffs of state workers, which could further set back the recovery.
I'd like to welcome the national correspondent who's joining us, and we can say goodbye to Jeff Stein, White House economics reporter, and Tony Romm, senior tech policy reporter. Thanks so much, Jeff and Tony. Great to see you guys.
Thanks, Libby.
So, Griff, we're so glad that you can join us. We were just talking about states and the economic quandary that they're facing, and you've been reporting on this really interesting thing that's happening in the states, which is that the people who are in charge of the medical portfolio, so whether it's the chief medical officer or whatever word they have for it in their states, they've suddenly gone into this very high profile role. And we can all relate depending on where you live, because you perhaps now know the name of that person who's the chief medical officer of your state or region. Why were you looking at Ohio in particular?
Well, you're right, Libby. I mean, these are officials who were completely obscure, except unless you were in health policy yourself, you didn't know who your state health director was, I'm guessing, up until a few months ago. But in Ohio, the health director, Dr. Amy Acton, has become something of a celebrity there. She is really someone who is beloved by a large number of people there because the state is perceived to have moved very aggressively, very forcefully, and very effectively against coronavirus. You may remember back in March when other states were really hesitating about what to do. It was Governor Mike DeWine with Dr. Acton at his side who was the first to announce things like school closures or restaurant and bar closures. And he was really at the forefront of this national shutdown at a time when Ohio was really not particularly affected by COVID. They just had a handful of cases. But Dr. Acton was saying, this is coming to us, this is going to hit us hard, and we've got to act preemptively to make sure that it doesn't do the worst damage that it could do. And so we need to move now. And Governor DeWine, a Republican, took her up on that advice and acted. And that's earned her and him a huge fan base. There was an opinion survey showing that he has the support of about 86% of Ohioans in terms of how he's responded, a remarkable amount of approval of what he has done. And Dr. Acton has been someone who has gained a lot of renown for the way in which she's communicated with the people of Ohio. She's very clear. She communicates very complicated information about the virus in a way that people can understand. And she also has a real empathy and a real compassion. And she talks with people in a way that makes them feel like they are in this too, and that she's in this with them, that she's going to be there by their side and help them through it.
And you point out that she's a local girl, right? She grew up in Youngstown. You report that she was homeless as a child. So she has a lot of credibility with people of Ohio. But despite that, there's also a backlash happening. And you open your story with kind of an incredible scene. Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, so she lives in a upper middle class, a very nice suburb of Columbus, Bexley, Ohio. And she lives on a normal sort of tree-lined block, very leafy, kids out in the yard playing, people mowing grass. And one weekend day, a couple of weeks ago, all of a sudden the neighbors noticed that the guys with guns are showing up. And all of a sudden there are dozens of people standing outside of her house, and they are protesting her. They're protesting the way in which she's handled this crisis. And this has become a recurring situation where protesters keep coming back to her neighborhood, and neighbors actually are coming out and squaring off with the protesters and defying them and saying, we stand with our neighbor, Dr. Acton. The vast majority of Ohioans also stand with her if you look at the opinion polls. But it's interesting that it's not just a few dozen protesters who are against her. The entire House, the state House, the House of Representatives in Ohio actually voted, it's Republican dominated, they voted along party lines to take away most of her powers. And there's been a real backlash among Republican legislators, state legislators in Ohio. Even though the governor is a Republican, they have really rejected the way he's handled this. They've rejected the forcefulness with which he has approached the issue. And rather than go at him directly, they're going at her.
So, even having her in this position is so interesting because you point out that, she is a doctor. and that position isn't always filled by a doctor, right? And so the governor really was looking for someone with a medical background and expertise.
He was. He said very clearly that the previous two occupants of that position had not been doctors. I mean, you would sort of assume, I assumed before I started researching this, that the director of a health department of an entire state would be a doctor. But the one of the previous holders of this role was the head of the Turnpike Authority before he became head of the health department, and he had no medical background to speak of. But she came into this with 30 years in public health policy. As you mentioned, she grew up in Youngstown. She was actually homeless for a time during her childhood, had a very, very difficult childhood. And the governor, Governor DeWine, when he selected her, he said there were a few reasons. One was that she was a doctor. Two was that she had this background in a lot of public health matters, such as homelessness, teen suicide, opioid addiction. But also she had an empathy about her. She had a way of connecting with people, and it was from the fact that she has suffered in her life. She's had a hard life, at least her childhood, and she's pulled herself up and gotten to this position of great authority, and she's using that position to really help people who are getting hurt pretty badly during this pandemic.
So I want to welcome James Hohmann, national political reporter. Hi, James. Thanks so much for joining us. Griff, I just want to stay with this thought. What do the protesters want? I mean, what action items do they actually want as they protest Amy Acton personally?
They want the state reopened, and they want it done immediately. They want all businesses to be allowed to function. I talked to a Republican state legislator who said, look, the forecasts about how bad this virus was going to be just haven't been matched by reality, and it's time we got Ohio working again, get the economy going again. The counterpoint to that is, of course, that if Ohio had not acted, if the state had not shut down, these dire forecasts that were originally issued as far as how many people would die very likely would have come true. There would have been the high death tolls that were in those initial models. They haven't come to pass, thankfully, but experts will tell you it's because the state acted. The state shut things down. They shut down schools. They shut down large gatherings, and they did it before almost anyone else. And if you just compare two states side by side, Ohio and Michigan, Ohio acted more quickly, more forcefully than Michigan did. And even though there are actually a lot more people in Ohio than there are in Michigan, the number of people who have become infected with COVID is significantly lower in Ohio.
James, Ohio is certainly not isolated in the decision by a small vocal group, very vocal group, to be protesting medical experts and people in positions of authority. And Griff pointed out, it's not just the sort of the armed protesters who are standing outside of Dr. Acton's house. It's also members of the state legislature in Ohio. What are you seeing nationally across the country in terms of this pushback against medical expertise, James?
Well, these folks are still in the minority, Libby, and they still do not represent the majority of the Republican Party. This has become a very polarized topic. It's become very politicized. Our polling, which we continue to do regularly, shows that there is a divide between people who are afraid that they're going to get the coronavirus and that it could really hurt them, with people who want to reopen the state. Still remains a bigger correlation than partisan political identification. But the folks with guns on Dr. Acton's lawn certainly get our attention. Yesterday there was a protest in Lansing, Michigan, where all these barbers showed up and were giving away free haircuts on the lawn of the state capitol to try to get barbershops to reopen. These are getting covered even more by local newscasts. And the president is sort of encouraging this. It started with the Liberate tweet, but the Trump re-election campaign this week has been quite aggressively trying to recruit medical doctors who support the president to be willing to appear on cable television and local television as surrogates to argue that it's more important to prioritize reopening the economy over public health. And when Trump's communications director was asked this message puts you at odds with the public health professionals inside the administration, including on the White House coronavirus task force. His on-the-record response was, "These surrogates and this message is consistent with what the president thinks." So, again, the president obviously was willing to criticize Dr. Fauci by name last week after his congressional testimony, saying he's being too cautious. So there certainly is this tension there. The numbers are growing, the people who are antsy to reopen things, but still a minority, and still a very partisan breakdown. Older folks also tend to be less, you wouldn't necessarily know it by watching television and seeing some of the images, but our polls make clear that older people tend to be much more deferential to the public health experts generally, and experts overall, and more worried about the virus and the danger that it poses to them. And younger people, men, who tend to be more cavalier and more kind of reckless about taking risks, also much more kind of open, flip the switch. So we're seeing some of these breakdowns start to emerge. Also, another big dividing line along education. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to support the experts. College, PhD, versus not graduating high school. So this, as we've talked about in previous special reports, this has really become the new front in the culture war. And everyone sort of recognizes this is going to be the dominant issue in the presidential election, and Democrats are cognizant of it. They're seeing their own internal polls, and it's why, Libby, they're saying it's not an either or. It's not pick between people living and working. You can do both, and you can do it in a responsible way. And it's worth remembering Mike DeWine's a Republican. This is not Mike DeWine, who deserves a lot of credit and gets a lot of credit from the health experts for acting early. This is not a Republican, or the governor of Michigan, who was slow, is a Democrat. And so there's also a tension point, I think, between a lot of the kind of the mainstream Republican governors, Charlie Baker from Massachusetts, Larry Hogan from Maryland, and the White House, and some of the more conservative governors, especially from the Deep South.
Hey, James mentioned the president's comments about Dr. Fauci after he testified last week. But Griff, you pointed out in your story that there was that moment, sort of one of the tense exchanges of that hearing, where Rand Paul was critical of Dr. Fauci. Can you remind us of that, Griff, and how that sort of highlights or shows this phenomenon that you've been reporting on?
Yeah, so there was testimony in which Rand Paul was asking a question, but in the course of asking a question, says to Dr. Fauci, "Look, I don't think you are the end all." And Dr. Fauci says, "I don't think I'm the end all either. I am a medical advisor, a scientific advisor. I am there to provide the president with the best scientific advice possible." And I think that that's what Dr. Acton would say as well. That's her job. Her job is to advise the governor of Ohio on what the best course is scientifically and medically. And from there, it is up to the governor to make decisions. It's up to the president to make decisions. Obviously, we are still a nation that is run democratically by politicians, and there has been this backlash in Ohio where Dr. Acton has been framed by some, still quite a small minority, but some as this kind of medical dictator who is forcing the state into shutting down, into economic ruin. And of course, that's not the case. The person who is making these decisions is the governor of Ohio, and by all accounts, he is getting widespread approval for the way that he has handled it. What will be interesting to see is he has actually gone with the tide in terms of reopening Ohio. Ohio is opening somewhat slowly, but it is certainly opening. And I've talked to Democrats in Ohio who are very concerned. They've been very supportive of the governor all along, but they're quite concerned now that the state could be opening before it's ready. And obviously, whether that's something that is worth doing or something that's going to hit Ohio hard ultimately is something that we'll know perhaps in a few weeks. But there is emerging this concern now that perhaps the governor, by swimming with the tide of reopening And Democrats believe, he has to some extent buckled under the pressure that he's facing, that could be a mistake.
We'll be watching what happens. Griff Witte, national correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us, Griff.
Thank you so much, Libby.
All right, thank you. See you soon.
Take
James,
care.
in your Daily 202 today, you talk about this Columbia University study that's come out where epidemiologists are reflecting back and looking at the timeline of how things happen. And they estimate that if social distancing measures had happened just 1 week earlier, it could have saved lives in the United States. Take us through the numbers and why they're significant.
Yeah, so if you move the modeling backward, you kind of look at the infections. Obviously, one of the really challenging things about the coronavirus, Libby, is that you on average you start to show symptoms after 5 days, but some people it takes up to 14 days to show any symptoms, and then there's a lag time with getting testing and getting the results, and then typically people don't get hospitalized until their second week. So there's sort of now we're far enough away from early March to be able to kind of follow the curves and look at what would have happened. So these researchers, led by Jeff Hohmann at Columbia, basically concluded that some 30,000 lives, they give exact numbers, but these are estimates, these are models, they're not precise. You can't say with any certainty, but some 30,000 plus people would have lived if we started the exact same policies that we put into effect on March 15th nationally on March 8th, and that somewhere in the mid 50,000s of people, remember we lost 95,000 Americans. So a significant number of the fallen would have lived if we had moved those guidelines back to March 1st. Now, it was hard to take action that early. There wasn't a political will. People, the president obviously was downplaying it and dismissing it and was hesitant to even declare a national emergency for weeks. But if we had acted earlier, even Dr. Fauci said and got in trouble for it. It was the last time he appeared on a Sunday show was when he said, yeah, of course, if we had imposed the restrictions earlier, more people would have lived. And there's all these trade-offs involved, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a reminder that, the one, if we had acted earlier, we could have saved lives. Two, it's a reminder that by lifting these restrictions too quickly, we're putting lives at risk. And you have to lift. All 50 states are now lifting the restrictions to some degree. Connecticut was the 50th, but now the challenge is if you lift it too fast, you could repeat these curves from March. And it is. I mean, we talk about Michigan, the March 8th, the day. If the research said if you move it from March 15th to March 8th, 34,000 people live. I was at a Bernie Sanders rally covering it in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which has been a cluster of cases. And, there were more than 10,000 people packed together in close proximity, in a park. And it's breathtaking. A week later, everything was shut down. And, those are the kinds of things that were happening and where infections were spreading among that, those kinds of events. And those were the last rallies of the campaign. And so you think about, what if you hadn't had those kinds of those crowds and those settings and those rallies, but also now looking forward, we're obviously not going to flip the switch and go back to anything just like that. But these are things to pay attention to as we talk about the political conventions in the summer, and what are certain things going to look like. So the research is fascinating, even though it's backward looking. At a certain point, I know a lot of Americans want to get back to work, they want to recover the economy. But there is real value in studying and understanding the mistakes, not just to prevent future pandemics, but to understand how do we respond when we see inevitably the second wave of infections, and start to get some data on that. And so these are very legitimate things to look at.
Dr. Fauci had a conversation with our colleague Isaac Stanley Becker, who was looking at the question of vaccines and also the anti-vaccine movement. And Dr. Fauci raised some concerns about this name, Operation Warp Speed. Now, this is the name the Trump administration has given to finding a vaccine and fast. And Dr. Fauci told our colleague that, he wants people to know that the fast timeline is about, cutting through the finances and the investments of it, not trying to rush the medical part of it. So why are Dr. Fauci's concerns, important, James, in this question of America's trust in the vaccine process?
So yeah, he's saying that because we're seeing quite troubling, on the, we want to call them the fever swamps of the internet. Again, this is a fringe thing.
The fever swamps of the internet, you said?
Yeah. But this is actually, there's some kind of mainstream places on the web where people are forswearing the vaccine before it's, even been tested in humans, and are saying, I won't take this vaccine. I'm not going to take the risk. And so that's what Dr. Fauci's responding to. That's why he gave an interview to us, to Isaac, and said, it made clear this is investment. These are companies are crashing on these projects. We're still going to make sure that we test it in the right number of people before we roll it out. But we're just spending money to kind of simultaneously go 10 different tracks and hope that one of the tracks work. And we've never done that before. But it's not about taking shortcuts on patient safety, which is actually a concern polls show a fair number of people have. And so what he said in his interview with us is, I worry that name conjures up this idea, Operation Warp Speed. We're just moving so fast. We're cutting through all the hurdles. And so he said, I wish it had a different name. And so this is going to be a challenge for scientists generally. I mean, getting people. What's crazy about the anti-vaxxer movement, which we've written a ton about and I've done a lot of reporting on, is that it's not some very highly educated, high-income people don't vaccinate their children, despite the scientific evidence being very clear, despite the studies that they cite being retracted. Are there risks? Absolutely. But when you talk about herd immunity, when you talk about getting past the coronavirus, the vaccine is the key thing to be able to return to anything that we knew as normal before March. And so anyway, it is. There's the scientific hurdles, which are very real. And nothing like this has ever been done before. They're calling it Operation Warp Speed because they're really trying to do something that's never been accomplished in the history of medicine. They've never developed a vaccine like this for a novel coronavirus. It's really hard. But then, in addition to the very real medical and logistical challenges of giving a vaccine to billions of people, you have the public trust challenges of, like, how do you sell this to people who might not trust government, who might not trust experts, who might not trust doctors. A lot of the people, the face of the anti-vaccine movement is very frankly white, but a lot of African Americans and Asians and Latinos have very good historical reasons for not really trusting the government. From being experimented on in the past to, and so there's a lot of in the African American community, especially, there's a lot of skepticism of government experts and scientists. And so that's going to be another barrier. And so Dr. Fauci and others that I've spoken to in the government are very concerned about this side of things. And I think they're very much preemptively trying to prevent this from becoming, they don't want the vaccine to become a front in the culture war. They want this to be something everyone sees as a welcome miracle cure if we can make it work.
We had a gentleman named Gregory write into us from Beechwood, Ohio, and he says that he's a 59-year-old African-American man who has type 2 diabetes, and he says he's wearing a mask whenever he leaves home. And he pointed out that he does it limited ways, like if he's picking up takeout food or going to the grocery store. But Gregory wrote and said that he sees people of all ages not wearing masks. He wanted to know more about whether a mask really protects him. And then he asked, what are my options to stay safe as restrictions ease? And James, that's a question a lot of people are going to be asking as their governors or other local state governments ease restrictions, and they might not feel comfortable themselves, and they're watching their neighbors and the people around them make different decisions than they are.
Yeah, it's hard. And it is. So to the question about, like, do the masks work? There was some very promising research that was released earlier this week that shows, they really are helpful. I know it took a while for the government to suggest doing it because it doesn't really fit with our culture. 75% of germs are sort of stopped. And if everyone's wearing masks, it's definitely good. Even if you don't have an N95 mask, just a facial covering is it's proven to be helpful. Now, the problem is, I've been in these settings too, and it's hard because you don't want to, you don't want to cause a confrontation. And we actually, our colleague on the Metro staff has a column today, John Kelly, about, what's good etiquette for asking someone to please put on their mask if it's down, or if they're not covering their nose, maybe they don't understand, you're still putting out germs that way. And it is, different people are going to handle it differently. I think it's okay to say something, especially if you're elderly, you're at risk, you have diabetes, these people should wear the mask in when they're less than 6 feet away from you. And I think, there's going to be a lot of, unfortunately we are seeing things where kind of there's confrontations breaking out, and that's terrible. But I think it's okay to kind of for public signaling and, for lack of a better term, shaming, to say, like, please put on your mask. And some people are going to be jerks about it, but a lot of people, I think, will respond to it. I've been in a bunch of situations just around DC, at the grocery store, even, where the clerk had the mask down, and it was like, can you please put your mask back on? And she did. But it is. I think people are, especially just because it's not something we're used to, we're going to see more and more of that kind of slippage.
Well, and as you point out, James, it's become part of like a visual representation of a culture war right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Public health experts certainly wish it wouldn't, because they're not trying to make a statement. They're trying to keep people safe and healthy. And James, you also point out that sort of tensions are boiling over in some quadrants. I want to bring in our colleague Tracy Jan, a reporter covering race and the economy. Tracy, it's so good to see you again. And we are watching to see sort of these tension points and where people are taking out their fear and frustration. But a very disturbing story that you're reporting on is that Asian American doctors and nurses, these medical professionals, are encountering racism as they try to help people and do their jobs, or just walk down the street, frankly, because they are Asian. Tell us about your story.
That's right. Asian Americans everywhere, not just doctors, are seeing an uptick in racist incidents, both verbal harassment as well as physical assaults. And given that Asian Americans represent 18% of doctors in the United States, as well as I think 10% of nurses, even though they're only 6% of the US population, they're very much exposed to the same types of behaviors you see out in the streets, in the hospitals as well. So the people I spoke with just had the most heartbreaking stories. I had to talk to a nurse in the Los Angeles area who's an ER nurse, and he had a patient come in with all the COVID symptoms. The nurse was trying to get this patient to put on a mask, and the patient refused, flat out coughed in this nurse's face. Luckily, he had a face shield, but the spit went all over the guy's face shield, and blamed the Chinese for spreading coronavirus, saying that you people gave me coronavirus. And the nurse was from Indonesia. So there's a lot of, anyone who looks East Asian is presumed to be Chinese. And if you're presumed to be Chinese, they presume you have coronavirus. It's very unfortunate.
Did that man even stick around and get tested?
No, the guy actually got up and left the ER and refused all treatment because he didn't want an Asian nurse. So as a result, he was just walking around potentially spreading coronavirus everywhere. The same nurse had another incident a month later. By this time, his ER had set up like a tent outside of the hospital, like a lot of places around the country have. And it was specifically for people with COVID symptoms. Another patient walked in, had gotten all the vitals taken by a different nurse. And by the time the Indonesian nurse went to treat him, the man said, again, I don't want to be treated by an Asian nurse. He actually told the white nurse that he saw initially and said, I'm not comfortable being treated by an Asian nurse because I think I got coronavirus from this Chinese guy coughing near me at a store. This guy's colleague later told him what the patient had said. And it's not uncommon.
One of the people that you profile in your story, a doctor named Lucy, is remarkable for a lot of reasons. She's a young woman. There's a photo of her in your story, 28-year-old, right? So incredibly accomplished. And she has been really stunned to get this backlash and vitriol from people. What's her experience?
Right. She basically just had that at that point in time. This was when the coronavirus was first getting to Boston. And she had spent all day in the operating room intubating patients. She's an anesthesiology resident, and it's a very risky procedure where you stick a pipe down someone's throat, airways, to open it up, and you're getting, potential viral particles coming out in your face. She had the protective equipment. So she spent all day doing this. And as she was walking out of the hospital towards the T, as the subway is called in Boston, to go home, this man started following her for more than a block and just yelling all sorts of racist vitriol, blaming the coronavirus on her, on the Chinese people, expletives. And she was very scared that he would physically attack her, because it's happened around the country to other people. Luckily, the man did not attack her. But now when she treats patients, now she's on the rotation where she's in the COVID ICU, and patients are, mostly sedated, but it's in the back of her mind that anyone could harbor these similar bigoted sentiments. And in fact, her colleagues at other hospitals have also encountered patients who did not want to be treated by Asian doctors.
Pretty remarkable for that doctor in particular to spend her entire day saving people's lives and then leave the hospital. And instead of being thanked to have to deal with that sort of horrific, scary attack. James, there's a lot of concern about some of the dog whistles that have come out of the White House from President Trump, and not only dog whistles, which is sort of that, like, the dog whistle is the term of like something that like is so high pitched that only some can hear it. It's sort of signaling, but flat out direct comments that have sounded racist or had racial overtones, and there's a lot of questions about what sort of tone that sets nationally. So can you remind us about some of the things that have come directly from the White House that have raised concerns?
Yeah, Libby, there's been a lot. And even today, we talked about that Columbia study a couple minutes ago. The White House put out a statement responding to the study saying, tens of thousands of Americans died who didn't need to if we just put the social distancing restrictions in earlier. And a White House spokesman in an on-the-record statement said, well, this is essentially blamed the Chinese, not Chinese Americans, but the Chinese government, and said if China had been more transparent, then blame China for us being slow to impose these restrictions. The president has, our photographer, Javine Botsford, captured a script that the president had during one White House briefing where he had crossed out the coronavirus and called it the Wuhan virus, and then was calling it the China virus. During an exchange with an Asian American reporter last week, the weeks before together, I think it was last week, not the week before, she asked a totally legitimate question, and he started talking about China and said, why don't you ask China? Why don't you go to China? And she pushed back and said, why are you asking me particularly that? He got angry and abruptly ended the news conference and stormed off in a huff. Presidential leadership matters. That's, one of the, people look to the president. It didn't seem remarkable at the time, but you look to what George W. Bush did after 9/11 to make sure that people understood our enemy wasn't Muslims, but these terrorists. And then you compare Bush's response after 9/11 to the president's response to the coronavirus, and it is quite a contrast. There have been a host of other things where he's trying to make, that you see a lot of his close allies on Capitol Hill saying China needs to pay us for every dead American, that they, owe us blood money, which a senator said yesterday. And anyway, a lot of, there was a Pew poll that came out yesterday afternoon that said 16% of Americans get the primary, most of their news about what's happening with the coronavirus from the president, not, local TV news or national newspapers or any, they're getting it from the president. And those people are following the cues, and, rhetoric has consequences. And I think, it's always dangerous to draw a direct line, but it definitely has created a climate where people don't feel the shame, that doing the kinds of things that Tracy just so poignantly described that they would have a couple years ago.
Yeah, James, there is sort of the international diplomacy and the question of, what China did and the decisions of the Chinese government, et cetera. But then there's the finger pointing at Chinese people in particular.
Right.
And Tracy, you reporting your story, these comments by Peter Navarro, the White House advisor, who said in an ABC News that, I'm going to read the quote here, accused China of sending hundreds of thousands of Chinese to seed the coronavirus around the world, which certainly makes it sound like an intentional warlike effort.
Right, which is why it's not surprising that some of these doctors, as they're living their everyday lives, whether they're shopping at Costco or riding the metro, people are yelling at them, bat eaters, you're spreading the virus. This one doctor mentioned to me, this is not in the story, but she had a mask on at Costco. And not only did someone in line blame her for spreading the virus, but she was buying toilet paper. They said, now you're hoarding the supplies. And then she went into her car, and the person parked next to her said, you shouldn't wear a mask because you scare people like that because you're spreading the virus. So this rhetoric that's, in our national politics does matter.
Mm-hmm.
And it is having an influence.
Tracy, as you reported your story, it shouldn't be the responsibility of these doctors to take control of this narrative and educate the rest of America. But, there was an effort that you were writing about doctors trying to sort of show in their own words, like who they are and what they are. I want you to tell us about that, but then also expand to how are they finding support, right? Are they feeling like they have resources or government entities or, people to back them up?
Right. A bunch of doctors, maybe a couple dozen around the country, have started a hashtag I am not a virus campaign. So some of them got together and produced a video with cards showing the comments that have been directed towards them, the racist comments that they've been met with, and showed what they actually are in real life. These are people in life-saving professions. It's ironic. Much of this was positively received, but of course, once you're on social media, there's a lot of backlash too. So all the racist comments that were being directed at them in real life are now online. One doctor mentioned as soon as the campaign went up, she started getting comments like bat eater and other anti-Asian comments. It's really unfortunate. As far as efforts to help them, I know some of them had directly reported if the incident happened in the hospital. They've directly reported it to their supervisors, and they're getting support from them. It's really helpful. They've all told me when bystanders actually, even if they're strangers, express support. So on the metro or on the T one day, when the man was yelling all sorts of racist things at one of the doctors in Boston, she said there was a short woman standing next to her, a stranger, filming the whole thing, saying, "I got your back. Don't worry. I might look small, but I'll defend you." And another doctor mentioned that her intern, who happened to be white, spoke out against a patient who was asking the doctor where she was from and to go back to where she was from. She's from New Jersey. Her parents are Chinese immigrants. And the intern told the patient that it wasn't acceptable. Because in moments like that, when you're given a racist comment, sometimes you're so stunned that you just are not sure you're quite hearing things right. And this doctor mentioned that she felt almost a sort of shame for forgetting that this could happen to her.
James, what questions does this raise in your mind in terms of sort of the accountability in this moment for Americans?
Well, this is not the end of it. I mean, this is going to, the president's reelection campaign has said publicly that they're going to make China a big issue. And some of the attack ads they're running, they're going to try to brand Joe Biden as Beijing Biden or Beijing Joe. And they're going to, play clips of him being friendly with Chinese officials. The Trump campaign ran an ad recently with various Chinese leaders, and then they interspersed footage of Gary Locke, who is an Asian American, was a cabinet secretary under Barack Obama. They transposed, I assume by accident, with pictures of Biden as vice president meeting with Asian leaders, and so we're gonna. You're right, because a dog whistle is something not everyone can hear, and these are whistles, and so we're going to hear a lot more of them. And I think Tracy's absolutely right that it's just so essential. When allies speak up like that, the resident did. That's the Trump campaign is Trump obviously got elected as a running as a kind of a nativist and a xenophobe. Building the wall is so central to his political appeal. and it's worked for him before, and that's the same playbook he's going to run this time. And they're running it because polls and focus groups show that the voters they're trying to reach, it resonates with, and as long as that's the case, they'll continue running that playbook. And so if there becomes a social cost to it, then they'll stop. And so that's why it is important for people to speak up and call it out for what it is.
Right. Because in times of threat, it's a human nature to look for a scapegoat. And so in this case, it's China, which translates into any Asian looking person who's in America. And the FBI is mindful of this and has warned that hate crimes against Asian Americans are likely to go up, especially as states begin to reopen and people are no longer sheltered in place and they're going about in the world interacting with each other a lot more.
Tracy, obviously you'll be watching for that reporting angle. What else are you going to be watching in the next couple of weeks on your beat?
I'm looking at also a lot about the healthcare disparities too in the Black community, not just the fact that they're more likely to contract and die from coronavirus, but what were some of the early missteps, some accountability reporting from local officials, data that was not reported.
Great. Well, Tracy and James, it's so good to see both of you, and thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Tracy Jan covers race, covers the economy, covers cultural issues for the Washington Post. Thank you. And James Hohmann, national political reporter who writes the Daily 202. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thanks, Libby. Thanks, Tracy. Nice to see you.
You too.
That's all for our show today. We will actually be taking next Tuesday off, and we wish you a safe and peaceful Memorial Day weekend coming up. We will be back, though, Wednesday on this same channel for a very special event. Live coverage of the planned SpaceX launch. Now, this is the first time a private company will launch a flight carrying a crew, and it's the first time in nearly a decade that NASA astronauts will depart from U.S. soil. We will bring it all to you live Wednesday afternoon, starting at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and I'll be joined on set, social distanced, from astronauts and from experts, and we would love to have you there for this historic event as well. You can catch it on the Washington Post homepage, also our YouTube channel, wherever you are watching right now. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you, and take care.